Our opening thought are the words adopted by the General Assembly on the shared value of generosity. Generosity, we cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. Our next reading comes from Paulo Freire, from his work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He writes, "True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need to be extended less and less in supplication, so that more and more they become human hands which work and working transform the world." Our next reading is from James Baldwin, from his work, The Fire Next Time. "It is rare indeed that people give. Most people guard and keep. They suppose that it is they themselves and what they identify with themselves that they are guarding and keeping, whereas what they are actually guarding and keeping is their system of reality and what they assume themselves to be." Well, the last few weeks that I've been away from you feel something like a year, but we're back together to reflect on our shared values, the shared values in Unitarian Universalism that were recently adopted at the UUA General Assembly last year, 2024. The last 4 times that I was with you, we looked at the values of interdependence and pluralism and justice and transformation. And today we'll be reflecting on the value of generosity. In describing generosity and the shared values, the General Assembly adopted the following language, which I read before, but I'll read again. "We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality." Of course, one of my first things to look at when I look at a virtue tends to be philosophy. So I first looked at ancient philosophy and also some theological resources about generosity. And the first philosopher that comes to my mind when I think about virtue is Aristotle, but also often think of Confucius as well. But the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle categorized generosity as being one of a long list of moral virtues. And he saw it as the virtue related to the getting and giving of money. As is the case with the other moral virtues, Aristotle viewed generosity as a mean, a middle way between 2 extremes. And the extremes are always an extreme of deficiency and an extreme of excess. In this case, generosity is the mean between the excess of being profligate, not a word that I use very often, I don't know about you. Another way of saying that would be wasteful. So you have the excess of being profligate and wasteful as you give money, and the deficiency of, we're more, I think, aware of this one, being stingy or miserly. 100 years before Aristotle, the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius also characterized virtue as the mean between the extremes. In fact, if you look at Aristotle's and Confucius's understanding of virtue, you might think that they had gotten together to talk about this, but since Confucius came 100 years before, I don't think that was the case, and we don't have any evidence that Aristotle read Confucius, so they seem to have come to this idea of virtue being the mean between the extremes, independently of one another. And Confucius saw the virtue of generosity as the mean between giving too much and giving too little. Of course, the mean, as it relates to generosity for a particular individual, is related to their means in a different sense from the mean between the extremes, thinking of financial means. Generosity for someone with little means will look quite different than generosity for someone who possesses great wealth. A poor person giving $1 is more generous than a wealthy person giving the same or even perhaps a much larger amount. And for those with great wealth, one could pose the question, a challenging question, that part of what generosity entails is not taking more than one needs. So perhaps having great wealth is a sign of lack of generosity in that one may have taken more than they needed. And that would significantly inhibit persons from accumulating great wealth in the first place. Turning from philosophy to religious views on generosity, we see that all of the major world religions emphasize the importance of giving to others, especially to those who are in need and those who are the most vulnerable within the community. If you look at the major world religions and their teachings, loving others is at the heart, it's at the core of their teachings, and generosity is a key part of the expression of love for others. You see it across the many different world religions. So historically, when we look at philosophy and when we look at religion, there is nothing very controversial about the importance of generosity. And there even seems to be significant cross-cultural consensus that generosity is indeed a moral virtue and that not being generous is a vice. So if there's that kind of consensus, that lack of controversy about the importance of generosity, this begs the question of why the virtue of generosity has not been practiced more fully in both the past and the present. Of course, we know that historically, generosity is often overwhelmed by greed. As a small number of persons hoard their wealth and power to the detriment of the masses who are barely getting by. But for most of human history, there has been agreement that greed is bad for most of human history. I know there's a movie, was it Gordon Gekko or whatever? Greed is good. No, there's been consensus that greed is bad and generosity is good. And this has been applied not only to the giving of money, but also to being generous with other things, being generous with our love, time, attention, and service. Generosity is a virtue within human community, but here's something I think that gets lost. The social aspect of generosity sadly often gets lost in the current hyper-individualism of our culture. Generosity is not it's not only an individual virtue. It's also a deeply communal commitment, a communal commitment to the flourishing of all persons, a communal commitment to the protection of the most vulnerable among us. All things being considered, when you look at generosity, it's really much more about doing justice than it is about giving to charity. It's much more about justice than it is about charity. We have mistaken generosity as only being a virtue expressed by individuals, rather than seeing that it is also expressed in systems within our society. And this has contributed to an increase in systemic meanness. Meanness is the opposite of generosity. And along these lines, the virtue of generosity has been co-opted by the wealthy who take much more than their share, and then they define generosity as charity, which most often means that they're giving only the crumbs from the table of their banquet of excess. What tragically passes for generosity these days is the mega rich who have gained their wealth through exploitation of people and the planet, giving a small fraction of what they should be paying in taxes to charity. For generosity to be expressed more fully in our society, I suggest we need to move beyond our highly individualistic understanding of generosity and embrace a vision of systemic generosity in the service of systemic justice. Systemic generosity satisfies the basic needs of all persons through the just systems that allow all persons to flourish, thus making the expression of generosity as individual giving to charity much less necessary. That's what Paulo Freire was getting at. Systemic generosity is also much more stable and sustainable than individual generosity, as it does not rely on the charitable whims of individuals, which are often limited by their individual interests and are often focused on persons who are part of what the givers consider to be their in-group, as opposed to persons who may be viewed as the other. Systemic generosity is generosity for all, not just people who look like us, not just people who have the same color skin as us, not just people who believe like us, not just people who love like us. Systemic generosity is generosity for all. Finally, I don't think our reflections on the virtue of generosity can be complete without considering the importance of being generous to future generations. We owe future generations, first of all, an opportunity to live. But also, I think we owe future generations an opportunity to flourish. And this means we have a moral responsibility to give of ourselves generously so that future generations might enjoy peace, some element of harmony, equitable prosperity, justice, a healthy environment with clean air and clean water for all, and a livable climate for all. If there's any hope, and hope is part of generosity, generosity builds hope, generosity contributes to hope, as the General Assembly also put forward. If there's any hope for building beloved community, both in the present and in the future, the cultivation of the virtue of generosity in both its individual, but especially in its systemic expressions, is a critical part of the project for the well-being of all life in our one world house. May it be so. Hear these words of benediction. Within each of our hearts there is a most glorious light. Go forth and let its spark help you understand what troubles both you and others. Go forth and let its light of reason be a guide in your decisions. Go forth and bring its ray of hope to those in need of help in both body and spirit, that they may find healing. Go forth and fan the flames of passion to help heal our world. Go forth and spread the warm glow of love, pushing back the darkness of the world. Go forth and share your glorious light with the world.